Hey y'all, this is Thoughts Between Shots, a storytelling podcast where one great question leads to one unforgettable story. I'm your host, Nammy Sirur. Every episode, I ask my guest to tell me a story, and then we talk about why it worked. If you want to get better at storytelling, asking better questions, or basically becoming better communicators, you're in the right place. This week, like every week, I have a really exciting guest, and I want to go right into the story so that you can see for yourself why they're so great. Will, tell me about a moment that altered your life's course and what lesson it taught you.
So yeah, mine's sad. Fair warning. When I was a teenager, I used to go on canoe trips. So I went to a canoe tripping camp called Wanapitei. And Camp Wanapitei was known for being the most hardcore canoe tripping camp, I think, in Canada, at least in Ontario. So the campers and the counselors would always pride ourselves on, we do the hardest trips and we do the most intense hardcore portages and whitewater rapids. And, that was the whole thing. It's like, we're hardcore. And so my sister went first, and then I went, and my little brother started to go as well after we kind of went one after the other. And the first time I went, I hated it, and I was so awful. It was only 2 weeks, but I was just miserable the whole time, and like I brought the wrong clothes, and my canoe would always dump in the water, and I would just be wet and miserable. And then the next year, I just started to figure it out and realize how awesome it was, and it became this really important thing for my confidence as a teenager. It's like doing hard trips, portaging with a boat on your back and it's killing you, but you just keep walking and you don't put it down no matter how much in pain you are. You really develop a sense of responsibility and all this stuff. So long story short, it was an incredible experience. On my final year, we were on a trip which the camp called V2, which was a 52-day canoe trip in the Northwest Territories and Yukon of Canada. So it's just the most amazing, rugged beauty, nobody around. We went on a river that had no maps, that clearly no European people, at least in Canada, had ever been on this river because there was no reports on this river. And it was really intense, but amazing. And as I was on this trip, I felt like, I was finally becoming a man, so to speak, even though I was only 17. I was really incredible. I was having the time of my life. And then on day 44, we saw a plane in the sky, and we were in the middle of the Northwest Territories. So like we thought we were in the middle of nowhere. So like, oh wow, there's a plane. Wonder what they're doing up here. And then the plane came back again. And I'm just thinking like, oh man, like, is there a hunting lodge up here? But it seems like they're trying to make contact with us. We'd seen no other people for, a month and a half other than our group of 12 kids and 2 counselors. Then the plane flies over again, and a bag falls out of it. And it's this big burlap sack, and we think they're dropping us food or something, like it's a care package, or we don't know what it is. And I remember one of my camp counselors just fell to her knees and started sobbing, and we were all laughing at her like, oh, why are you so emotional? This is great. And then they open up the bag, and it's just these empty milk cartons and a letter. And they opened up the letter, and it said, use your satellite phone and call the camp. And so everybody started realizing, okay, something's very wrong here. So they called the camp, and then they got off the phone and they said, okay, guys, they were very serious. And they said, we're going to paddle down the river. We're going to go meet that plane. And as we were paddling down the river, I just thought someone in my family's dead. And I know everybody else was thinking the same thing. And I was trying to I kept knocking on the wood in my boat, being like, everyone's okay. And I was knocking on the wood, like touch wood, touch wood. I was singing Bob Marley to myself. I was singing, don't worry about a thing. Everything's going to be all right. And we were paddling down the river, and we get there and we pull up maybe like 500 yards, feet, whatever, from the plane. And we can see it in the distance. And so everybody's just watching who's going to get out. And we're like, who's in that plane? And the leader said, you guys stay here. We're going to go meet the plane. And we all put our arms around each other because it was like this sense of like, who's it going to be? And 2 men got out of the plane. And the first man who got out of the plane was very tall. And I had a moment of, oh, good. There's no tall men in my family. Everyone's short. So it's not me. But then as they came back and the 2 men started to walk, I recognized my dad And at about the same time, they said, Will, please come over here. And so I went over to meet my father. And I was, as you can imagine, I had this sense of what the hell's going on. And I put my hands in my life jacket and I knew something was wrong. And I just said, I think I said, is it mom? And he said, no, but there's been an accident. And it's Lukey. And Lukey was what we call my brother Luke. And he was younger than me. And I just said, is he okay? And then my dad broke down crying. And then he said he drowned on his canoe trip. And I remember just standing there going, and then I started yelling, what the fuck? It's the only thing I could think to say. And I just started saying that over and over again. And then everybody came over to sort of hug me. I remember they were all lined up and gave me a hug. They were all crying. And at some point, we all sat down and we had to wait for the plane to get ready. So I remember even like 15 minutes after hearing this news, the shock hit. And one of our camp mates was a magician and he was doing magic tricks to kind of entertain everyone. And I remember laughing, and it was a really surreal experience to be laughing like right after hearing that news. And then eventually the plane was ready again, and we took off to fly into Norman Wells, the nearest town where we were supposed to be ending our trip, and then to go home for the funeral. And I remember just seeing the most incredible beauty, like in the mountains and the forests and everything, and looking down on it. The only thing I could think was, my brother's never going to be an uncle to my children. It's the only thought I could have. And then that was the moment my life changed forever. I think anybody who's lost somebody unexpectedly way before you expect to lose them is familiar with getting that phone call or receiving that news, and just life bisects. It just, you have before and after. And I think a lot of us have multiple moments like that. As we get older, we get those moments again. And sometimes they're positive, right? Like sometimes it's the birth of your child, or it's meeting your spouse for the first time, or it's hearing that you got into a prestigious school, and sometimes it's great. And then at other times it's like the worst thing ever. And the only thing I ever look back on with any kind of gratitude or positivity is that it changed me forever, in the sense that I became much more empathetic with people, especially people who weren't doing well and people who are struggling. Because before that, I never really had this sense of like grief or loss or difficulty in my life. I'd grown up pretty privileged, pretty middle class. My parents were divorced, but that was like the worst thing that ever happened to me. I mean, there were some other things, but that's a much longer story. But in general, I grew up quite comfortable and privileged. And so, yeah, this kind of tapped me into what, that YouTube channel, The Soft White Underbelly. It's amazing. This guy just films people who are kind of like down and out members of society or whatever. So people who are like drug addicts or former drug addicts or prostitutes, people that like society often overlooks, and he just asks them to tell their story. And he shoots it all in black and white. And my wife watches these videos all the time, and they're sad, but they're kind of beautiful. And it sort of reminds you of the humanity of even people who like seem like they're dangerous or forgotten or whatever. And I felt like it kind of tapped me into the soft white underbelly of what most people are going through but not talking about. And it made me forever connected to the topic of grief. And I've started talking about it more, which has helped. And it's now going to be 20 years this summer. It'll be 20 years since it happened. So it's much easier to talk about now than it was. And now I look at it as my mission to talk about, because when other people talk about grief, it becomes easier for those who go through it.
I love that story so much, and I love not just the moments, those inflection points, but the lessons. I think that's the biggest thing, right? It's what have you learned, but also what can you impart to your audience. So first, before we get into the breakdown of the story, let's talk about who you are and what you do. So who are you, Will?
Yes. Well, my job title is a public speaking coach and a speaker. But I see myself kind of as like a guinea pig for my audience and my clients. Is I'm putting myself out there and trying to tell my story as much as possible on podcasts like this, but I also tell this story on stages or versions of it. I try to make sure that my clients know the story. I try to share the story in bits and pieces on LinkedIn. I write about this sort of stuff in my newsletter. And I believe that if you can share your story bravely and openly and intentionally, you don't just trauma dump on people. And if I've done that to anyone listening, I apologize, but I'm trying to do this as intentionally as possible. I believe that you can create real relationships with people, and not real relationships as though, okay, I'm going to, Clarissa, now you're going to, come from Texas to help me move my couch in Canada next time I need it. But that you and I really like, we're going to be closer after this. I believe that. And I believe that after having had this conversation, you and I will have more of a relationship. And I also know that anybody who listens to this will have a relationship with me that's more than zero.
Yeah.
And that can only be a good thing from my perspective, as long as that opens them up to wanting to share their story a little more. And then maybe if they're the exact kind of person that I want to work with, they come to me and they say, hey, I want to work with you. That happened the other day, actually. Somebody saw a podcast that I was on and said, I'd like to work with you. And she said, I listened to a lot of podcasts, but you actually told your story. So I think it has real power. And I think the more we understand our own story and the more we understand how it shaped us and the more we can communicate that to other people, the better of a personal brand or a personal elevator pitch, if you want to call it that we will have. And that just makes it easier to build your business, to make relationships, to sell whatever it is that you're offering, and to get opportunities that you otherwise wouldn't have if you just hide behind your resume or your experience, which too many of us do.
Yeah, I believe that 100%. Because for one, I mean, the whole reason this podcast exists and the whole reason I even reached out to people like you is that I found out about your story through what you'd put out on social media.
Right.
And a lot of people, I think, underestimate the power of story, but they also misunderstand what storytelling really means. Because, especially for me, I come from, I'm Indian, and we're a very sort of academic focused community, and especially the community I come from, it's very sort of put your head down and work and don't ruffle any feathers. I'm from a very like docile, well behaved people. And
Right.
so any form of storytelling seems like self promotion. I actually got this question from someone recently. She said, I'm not a celebrity. Like, I'm just a person working in an office. Why would I want to tell stories? What would that even look like for me? How would you answer that question? I'm so curious.
I just look to examples from our entertainment, the things that people actually pay money for that has no monetary value.
Hmm.
People watch reality TV, people read books, they watch movies. They don't know who the characters are when the show starts. They learn about the character's life, whether this is a fictional character or real character, or like reality TV, maybe somewhere in between. The power of story. There's a quote I love from a professor in Toronto called Keith Oatley. He said that fiction is like a flight simulator for human life. So when you read someone else's story, you get to go through their life and witness all of their crashes and burns without actually suffering them yourself. And it makes you more emotionally intelligent. It makes you more empathetic because you've kind of lived somebody else's life, at least a piece of it, and realize, oh, well, I'm not a single mother in Cameroon, but I've read her story and I've read somebody who maybe knows her or is her and has written about it. Or you listen to somebody tell their story on a podcast and you feel like, oh my God, I was there for their childhood. I could picture the living room that they spoke about. I could see what it was like when the police showed up at their house. Every time I experience that myself as a listener, I'm reminded of the power of stories, even for people who are not celebrities. Yeah, it's cool to hear Matt Damon talk about his childhood because you're like, it's Matt Damon, cool. But why wait to be Matt Damon? Like, your story has value without you being famous or important, because you're a human being who has a unique experience on this planet. You have a collection of experiences that nobody else has. And if you can figure out what makes it truly unique and tell it in a way that makes it unique, that is very powerful. And you can really affect people's emotions in that way and help them see the world through the eyes of another, which at the end of the day is that's what we're paying for when we go to a movie.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and even if you don't want to be, even if you don't aspire to be the next Matt Damon, storytelling isn't just this grand thing that you tell on a stage, right? It's literally just communication. It's how you talk to your kids in a more effective way. It's how you get them to behave because you tell them a bedtime story or, those fables that we grew up with. Or it's how you do a
yeah,
presentation at work to make it more interesting and engaging. It's in those everyday interactions we have with other humans by infusing storytelling, which basically just means you become more effective at thinking through what is the beginning, middle, and end? What is the connecting through line? How do I make somebody feel something when
yeah,
I say this thing? And what is the takeaway? That's storytelling, and it can be, in the form of any mundane thing you're talking to someone about.
totally. And it grounds whatever you say in some kind of reality.
Yeah.
Because if you say, hey, when you're growing your business, if you hire people too fast, too soon, you could run out of money. So be careful. People hear that and go, oh, that's good advice. But if I say in 2023, my company was making 250K a year, and we had one client who was worth 177 grand of that, and they had told us that they were going to sign on for another year. And I thought, as the business owner, oh, gee, this growth will just continue. And I hired 2 full-time employees, one general manager, one sales rep. And then a month later, my daughter was born, and I took a month off for paternity leave. And basically, from the time I came back from paternity leave with a newborn, trying to make sense of my new reality, I had to fire everybody, and our pipeline completely dried up within 6 months. If I tell you that, you're gonna remember that a lot more
Yeah.
than like, hey, don't hire too soon,
Yeah.
or make sure your growth is predictable before you hire, or whatever the takeaway is. But that story, it's gonna stick with you because it's clear, it's detailed, it's real. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't know that as the listener, but I promise you it is. But like, you can I think we can kind of tell. You can tell when somebody's telling a true story or
Yeah.
not, more or less. Like, some people are very skilled at lying, but usually you can tell when it's a real story. And it just is easier to remember things wrapped up in a story because of our deep evolutionary connection to storytelling. It's what we used to do around the campfire when we were hunter gatherers. We would share information about our day. There's a great book called The Storytelling Animal by Jonathan Gottschall, which breaks this down. Anybody interested in storytelling should read this book, but it's all about the evolutionary biology and psychology of storytelling.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to
Yeah,
check out that book.
yeah.
There's one more thing I wanted to talk to you about, Will, especially because the story you told is particularly difficult and emotional. And often a lot of novice storytellers don't quite know how to tell an emotional or difficult story about trauma without, like you said, trauma dumping on the audience.
Yeah.
So, how do you coach people to talk about difficult things without it seeming like they're expecting the audience to be their therapists?
It's so funny because I've almost never seen a true trauma dump on stage. I have seen it, but it's
Mm.
very rare. And the reason I think for that is most people go too far in the other direction and they share nothing.
Ah.
I would say that the only time it's a trauma dump is if the takeaway is I need to get this off my chest or else, then it feels like a trauma dump.
Mm.
If you share it intentionally, the reason I share my story is because I know how important it's been for me to hear other people talk about grief and difficult things in life. When I heard Patton Oswalt talk about his wife's death 6 months after she died, and he was already on stage touring, and he went on the Stephen Colbert show and he talked about grief, and Stephen Colbert said, how are you able to talk about this so soon after your wife died unexpectedly? He said, grief is stronger when it's in the dark, and when you shine a light on it, it becomes less scary. And that's always stuck with me. And I realized him talking about it, even as he was emotional, even as it was still raw for him. People say share your scars, not your wounds, but I think people can even share their wounds in the right way. And just to say, hey, I'm going through it right now and I'm really struggling, but I'm sharing this because I think somebody else out there might be feeling the same way, and I want them to know they're not alone. or somebody needs to know about this. There needs to be awareness. Like, as long as the reason for sharing it is not selfish, then I think the audience can hold it and can see the value in it. When it feels like I've just got to get this off my chest, otherwise I'm going to have a mental breakdown, or I'm too scared to go to therapy, so I'm going to treat this boardroom like my therapy, or I'm going to tell you the story. I saw a brutal thing the other day where a guy used a personal traumatic story in a cold email as like
Oh
a
no.
very obvious sales tactic. And it was
Mm.
just was gross. It was not earned. It wasn't vulnerable. It was to make him seem cool and to be clickbaity and interesting. And it just came across so cynical. It's not that anytime you share personal, vulnerable stories, that's a good thing. It's got to be done with intention. But the intention should be, I'm sharing this, even though it scares me, because I think it has value to the audience. And so the trick is finding the value for the audience
Yeah.
and being clear on that.
100%. Because the audience is always asking, what's in it for me, right? Even if they're not conscious of it, that is sort of how we're all wired. So, yeah, you do want to talk about stuff that's sort of at least somewhat resolved, because then you have that ability to give the takeaway. Everything you just said was like, pew, 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 pew. Like,
Yeah. I'm sorry. I also talk a lot, so I'm sorry if I've been going off on lots of tangents. I know it's hard
no.
as the host. You're trying to like, which part do I do I answer?
No, this was all great because I just like, I nerd out on this stuff. So I was just like, yeah,
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 it's
all of that.
really fascinating. And I do want to add one point, because I was on a podcast recently talking about this, where this person said, "Oh, this is the takeaway for your story," to another person who was sharing. And I just said, you don't always have to make the takeaway explicit.
Hmm.
Sometimes hearing somebody's perspective told honestly, and from a place of like sharing vulnerably, and from a place of enough strength that the audience is not worried you're going to have a mental breakdown, but sometimes that's enough.
Hmm.
And just to hear somebody's unique experience and hear how something happened that changed them in a meaningful way, that's what a story is. And the best famous stories from our culture don't have explicit takeaways. They have implicit takeaways. Romeo and Juliet doesn't say at the end necessarily, I mean, he kind of does with the captain's or the prince's monologue, but it doesn't say, okay, audience member who's just heard this story, you should really think about what tribal warfare does to human beings. And you should really think about how the younger generation is affected by century-old blood feuds. It doesn't say that. It just goes, all are punished. That's one of the last, lines. It doesn't have to hit the nail on the head. It doesn't have to be so on the nose. You
Hmm.
can just tell your story and allow the takeaways to kind of come up organically. Sometimes I find storytelling in a business setting is cheapened by the person trying to have too polished a takeaway from it. Because then I'm like, are you sharing this because it's real, or are you just trying to like sell me something? Or are you just trying to come up with your 7 top tips for entrepreneurship? So I think people need to be careful about that, is like, allow the story to speak for itself a little bit. And you don't need to make everything such a clear, polished metaphor or takeaway for entrepreneurship or business or leadership.
I do tend to be that person who's like, moral of the story.
Yeah.
But I think it's an advanced technique to say, I'm going to let this sit with the audience and let them come up with their own, even though it's probably not super ambiguous, but still there's different angles to something, right? And they can come up with their own conclusions. So
Or at least
yeah.
make it personal. So to
Mm.
be like, I went through this and I started to learn this sort of thing, rather than here's what you should do. Because that's when it becomes a bit preachy and a
Mm.
bit on the nose. If you try to keep it to, this is what I learned from this, then they can hear that and go, oh, that's a good lesson. But you don't have to be like, so all you people out there, this is what you should do, Something to think about.
Yeah. No, this is so. All of this is. I hope y'all are taking notes. This is blowing my mind. Um, I don't want to keep you for too much longer. So I just want to know, where can people find out more about your work, hire you as a coach, or just see your storytelling in action?
I think the best place is LinkedIn. LinkedIn, Will Greenblatt, my name. If you search me on there, you'll find me. I call myself a recovering child actor, so that's part of the way I identify myself on there. From there, you can find my speaker reel, which tells my story. I have a couple things on my YouTube channel which help tell my story, but I'm still building that out. And from there, you can also find my community. I have a school community. I have calls that you can book a one-on-one with me. And also, if you work for a company and you're interested in bringing me in, I love doing storytelling workshops for companies as well. All of that's really available through LinkedIn. Will Greenblatt is the place.
All right. And we'll link all of that below. Thank you so much, Will. This was such a rich conversation, and I know that the audience got so much out of it.
I
I
hope
know
so.
I did. Even as a storytelling nerd, there was stuff that was new to me. So this was so fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. And that's a wrap on this episode of Thoughts Between Shots. If you laughed, cried, got goosebumps, found something sneaky useful, share it with your people and get in touch. If you want to be my next storyteller or know of a good storyteller, send me a DM. Also, send me your favorite questions to ask future guests. Until next time, keep being curious and keep telling good stories.